Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. It is episode 100 of this podcast, and I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who have been here at any point in this journey, whether you're just joining for this episode, whether you've been here since the beginning. Thank you so much for contributing to this, each and every one of you for helping to make this possible. And so, with this 100th episode, I wanted to make a particularly special episode, something incredibly relevant to what I'm doing here and to all of us, because this podcast about civic education and making politics more accessible and just diving into all these things in a more in-depth way and with angles that people haven't really considered before. And so there's been a whole bunch of different topics and many of those unique, but I wanted something in particular to be as appropriate, I guess, for a 100th episode. And so I decided on that being the question of what does it mean to be an American? And it is very convenient that this episode just happens to fall right around the 250th anniversary of this nation. It was not planned like that. It just happened to work out that way. This is a question that I've thought a lot about over the years, and you probably have too. And it is something that we should constantly reevaluate. What does it mean to be an American? And I'm not talking about legal implications. I know we've got a lot of conversations about immigration going on, especially birthright citizenship, and that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'll let other people discuss that. And it's not a matter of trying to avoid those tough questions that unfortunately have a lot of partisanship and ideology tied into them. It's just that I want to get to more of the core of what an American is, something that we can all discuss more reasonably compared to a lot of these highly emotionally charged discussions that are typical of basically everything in politics. And of course, I'm not talking about anything pop culture either. So I'm not talking about fast food that we've exported or any of our celebrities that are known worldwide. Of course, I'm not talking about that. I'm trying to get to the philosophical, values-wise implication of what being an American is all about. And you also have to be careful with blanket statements, and that's something I try to reiterate anytime I'm talking about any of these, whatever topic it is that I'm talking about. You don't want to make too many blanket statements unless you can say with 100% certainty, this is how it is every time for whatever it is. So it's really hard to make a clear, like, oh, this is what being an American is. But I'm going to attempt to try to dive into it anyways. And this is also an invitation for you to tell me and others that listen in what you think being an American is, because it might be something different than what I talk about. But I will still try to put forth my own definition anyways. But before we get to that, I think it makes most sense to start off with this idea of, can a list or criteria of what an American is, can we even make that? Is there this checklist, whether it's like one that you could actually make or an unwritten rule that says, oh yeah, this is all the things that make somebody an American? It actually might be easier to list what is definitely not American, but even then there are going to be arguments. And sometimes they're partisan or ideological in nature, and sometimes it's just a pure, legitimate, earnest difference in opinion. Not that partisan and ideological arguments can't be earnest, but a lot of times they are more couched in those biases of what somebody's political views are and not recognizing those political biases. But we could at least start off with some more general American values and how people interpret them. You've got maybe the most obvious ones are things like freedom, equality, justice, loyalty to the country. Of course, you would expect somebody who is a true American to be loyal to the country. I don't think that's exactly a controversial opinion, but what does that loyalty look like? And some people definitely have differences in opinion of what that loyalty looks like. Obviously, you can't sell secrets to a foreign entity. That is definitely not loyal to country, but a lot of times what loyalty is couched in those biases, and a lot of times we get so upset that somebody thinks differently than us that we start to say that they're not loyal to the country, they're trying to destroy it, when they really just have different ideas of what's best for public policy. And freedom is a seemingly obvious concept. Theoretically, we all believe that we should be free to express ourselves, to express our opinions. In practice, it doesn't always work out that way, and a lot of times when one group is in power, they try to suppress the ability of another group to be able to profess their own opinions that are contrary to what the majority in power is trying to promote. Equality can also be very fraught with political, partisan, and ideological arguments, especially when you talk about it in the context of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. But you don't have to talk about it in those terms. We theoretically all agree that we have equal rights. Now, of course, there are some people that definitely don't believe that. I'm not talking about those people. They like to separate people into an other and then our group. It's that typical in-group, out-group mentality. And a lot of times we like to say, oh yeah, we believe in equality, we believe in equal rights, but those people don't. And that's a lot of times that's not true. And then this concept of justice, a lot of people also turn into a political argument. But if we boil down justice to its essence, I think most of us would actually support the idea of justice. Now, how that actually plays out can be a lot different, but the very essence of it, I think the vast majority of people in this country would agree on. And another front of this whole what are American values is this individualistic versus collectivist tug and pull, where you have a lot of countries, especially over further east, that have more of a collectivist mindset, and they tamp down a lot more on the individual, whereas America can sometimes too much veer into the individualistic territory. But both of these things are important. Individualism is a very core part of being American, but you also still have this concept of a melting pot of cultures and everybody else being able to share in the promise of America and what America is all about. And that is inherently collectivist. So in a funny way, this whole individualist mindset, there's a collectivist mentality where we all actually, or a lot of us, agree on the need for individualism. And there's this fine balance that you have to strike. And I think for the most part, America and American politics does a pretty good job of balancing those two, because you need to have the individualistic ability to profess your own views and not be forced to go along with a group, or whether it's your group that you most identify with, or just this general problem we have with groupthink, where people can't step out of line supposedly with what others think. And a lot of people would agree that we should have an individual mindset, or that the individual should be respected. But a lot of times I don't think we really do. I mean, you look at how many times a Republican has tried to take a different approach to something than the Republican Party at large agrees with, and how much they're excoriated, or how much a Democrat has tried to step out of the typical line of what a Democrat is normally considered, and they get excoriated. And you see that a lot more when that party is in power. back when Democrats were more in control of the government, it was a lot less tolerated by the greater Democratic apparatus for that Democrat to step out of line. Now that Republicans are more in charge, now it's if you're a Republican and you try to step out of line, now you're going to get blasted. And that's just not how things should be. Yes, there has to be some level of party cohesion for you to be an efficient party. I get that, but this idea of, trying to tamp down on dissent, this is the exact thing that one of the things we fought against back in the 18th century against the British Crown was the fact that we could not voice our opinions about British policies and that we didn't have a say. And so a lot of those things that we, supposedly support about American independence, now those same things about being able to tolerate dissent and freedom and the ability to profess your own views. Now we're suddenly, when it's threatening our power or our influence, then suddenly we don't care as much about those values. And that's just not how it should be. But I think that also is a good segue into this idea of there's a difference between un-American actions versus actually having anti-American values. Because really, any one of us can act in an un-American fashion. If we take the idea that being an American means respecting people's freedoms and allowing them to make their own choices for their lives as long as they are not infringing upon other people's rights, well, a lot of times when we are the ones in charge or people that we support are in charge, we become a little bit more tolerant of trying to infringe upon the freedom of expression of people who have different opinions on public policy and the direction of the country. I would argue that that is a very un-American action. Doesn't necessarily make you un-American. It makes you biased. It makes you human, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're anti-American. Otherwise, I don't know if any one of us could be considered American at that point, because a lot of times, or at some point, all of us go against the ideals of what America is in the first place. And you see a lot of times in American history how much there was a dictation of who was a quote-unquote true American or who was really patriotic, and that concept was overly dictated. And one of the most obvious examples of that is during the McCarthyism era, during the Red Scare, where Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, basically without evidence, or at least at most flimsy evidence, accused all these people of being communist, of being so fundamentally anti-American that he was purging them from all sorts of places in government and in the military. And eventually people got tired of it, but it went on entirely too long. And there were people that did speak out about that. One particular example of that was Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr.'s writing about what is loyalty, a difficult question, and basically called for both conservatives and liberals of the time to cool it here, because this whole, when you look at communism and in all these other countries, how much they tamp down on dissent, and yet in a democracy, we were emulating a lot of those same tactics that a communist government was doing, especially like in the Soviet Union back then. And you see a lot of times now in places like China and North Korea and Iran and Cuba. And yet we were doing a lot of those same things, even though we ostensibly talk about how vile and corrupt and oppressive those governments are. And yet we've done the same thing. And not just during the McCarthy era, we've done it at multiple points throughout American history. And it just goes back to this whole concept of we can take un-American actions, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have un-American values. We sometimes forget what being American is all about. We get blinded by our ultimate wants and desires for public policy, but we don't. It doesn't mean that we're actually against what America stands for. But it also takes a lot of self-awareness to be able to recognize that. And so, with those things in mind, because of all these different concepts of what an American is, there is arguably a lack of a clear answer as to what it means to be an American. And that can be both a strength and a weakness. It means that we can truly have a marketplace of ideas where we legitimately consider other people's points of view, much more than you would see in any other country. But that can also lead to a lot of arguments, and it can lead to a lot of violence that we've seen in American politics, especially as of late. And you find a lot of things can be both a bane and a weakness when it comes to American politics. But there are still a lot of shared values that we have. It's just that we have differing opinions of whether they are being realized. Right now, a lot of Republicans would say that those shared values are being realized of freedom and justice, but a lot of Democrats wouldn't because of who's in the White House. And then when it inevitably flips in the future, you're going to see a lot of Democrats that start saying all these values are being realized, and Republicans are going to say that it's not being realized. But we still do have a lot of core values that are still the same. It's just easy to forget or to not see it because of the loud, polarized minority that doesn't actually really respect freedom and equality for other people, who think of other people as less than themselves. Conservatives, moderates, and liberals, if that's the spectrum that you want to use, no matter how conservative or liberal somebody is, vast majority of us do believe in the core value of freedom. We do believe in the core value of justice and equality and the importance of the family. Might have different ideas of what family is, but we still believe in the importance of family. And the vast majority of us believe in the importance of the U.S. Constitution, even if we have different ideas about how to make it better. But when you really try to boil down things, when you actually try to listen to other people, you find a perhaps surprising amount of agreement on things. And that's one of the themes that you've seen in a lot of episodes of this podcast that we've talked about. Like when I talked to Drs. Guy and Heidi Burgess about constructive political discussions, you actually find, well, okay, you know what? There's a lot of common ground there. Or Nathan Smolensky talking about common ground in politics. It's easy to, we're hardwired to look at what we consider threats. And we often consider threats to be things that are foreign to us, that are different to us. So when we have this very strong tie to all of these political beliefs that we have, and somebody else has different political beliefs, we oftentimes think of them as like completely off the wall. These are people that are crazy. But really, if you try to boil down a lot of what they believe in, it looks a lot like what we think is important. It's just we have different ideas of how to get there. And like I said before, this is not a new thing. And you see a lot of historical writings about the meaning of being American. And there's really just too many to list here. And not all of these writings outright say, oh, this is what it means to be an American. But it does ultimately have a lot of relevance to that question, and you can apply it to that question. Because they're still incredibly... How many things have the Founding Fathers written that you can apply to what it means to be an American? Thomas Paine's Common Sense, before the United States even became an independent nation. Or the Federalist Papers, talking about the core tenets of the American system of government, and by definition, American values. But then, of course, even with the hopeful stuff that you have some of the more pessimistic opinions of what it means to be an American, but ultimately they do still have a glimmer of hope, especially with the, to put it lightly, checkered history of race in this country. And a couple of the really seminal works that you can look to are by scholars and brilliant thinkers like Frederick Douglass, who was once a slave and then became emancipated and was largely self-educated. He wrote, what to the slave is the 4th of July. And it was a very, very critical of American history up to that point, and with good reason. The idea that all men are created equal, well, for one, that idea leaves out women, but it also was applied more to white men, and not just white men with property. And you see that same through line with how much the right to vote was expanded over time. But with Frederick Douglass, as much as he lambasted American history and America not realizing its promises up to that point that he had written this, he still wrote about that glimmer of hope about how America still has the capacity to improve, and that it had been improving up to that point. And in a similar vein, you have former Supreme Court Chief Justice Thurgood Marshall talking about when he wrote Reflections on the Bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. Because for all of the amazing things that the U.S. Constitution did for how forward-thinking it was, there were still very clear, obvious defects in it, namely that it didn't solve slavery. You had the 3/5 compromise, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of population. But of course, those slaves didn't get to enjoy that, even those 3/5. It was their owners that got to have that power of the 3/5 of a person. And you look at all those things that are a huge stain on the history of America, but you still see how much of the promise of America was still there, how uniquely suited America was to be able to improve, with how the U.S. Constitution can be amended over time, with how ideas can be debated earnestly in a public forum. And you don't really get that in most, if any, countries. Some countries, yes, you do get to debate that, but not to the extent and in the same vein that America gets to. At least from a legal standpoint now. Sometimes people still have their ability to express themselves trampled over, but the fact that we still can improve over time, and we have improved over time, and a lot of those means of suppression have been severely mitigated, still speaks to just how unique America is and how politics in this country have, for all its defects that it still has, how much it still has vastly improved over time. And you can see that even with the countless speeches by American presidents over time, both Republican and Democrat, and of the parties that are no longer here, Federalists and Whigs. And so that just speaks to it's one of the many things that I think speaks to the uniqueness of being American. Because most, if not all other countries, they have a distinct cultural identity that makes them that country. That, oh, this is what it means, and this might be out of pocket, so forgive me, and if I am wrong, please educate me on this. But there's a certain identity that makes somebody much more clearly French or German or Spanish or Portuguese or Brazilian or Mexican or any other case. Not to say that they don't have any variety or that they don't have some sort of legitimate debate about what their identities can include, but they are still pretty overall distinct in their culture and in their identity. But America's not like that. It is very unique in how it is not really a specific culture that everybody agrees on, or that the vast majority of people agree on, but it's a blend of cultures. The fact that it's not uniquely distinct makes it uniquely distinct, because there is this, and sometimes it can be a source of tension, but this whole, there is some level of agreement on what being American is, but there also isn't. And there still is a whole pluralistic mindset of all of these cultures living side by side that you really just don't get anywhere else. Not to the same level, not to the same degree. And you also have to imagine how vast America is compared to most other countries. It's one of the most populous countries in the world, and certainly amongst the most populous countries, it is much more culturally varied when you compare it to something like a Russia or a China or India. And again, that's not to say that none of these countries have some level of variety or anything like that they're all samey, but America has a certain level of diversity that you really don't find anywhere else. It's one of the few countries, if not the only one, where you can actually become a citizen of the country coming from any other country and be treated as such, at least by most other Americans, without having to be here for generations. And a lot of other countries, even when you become a citizen of that country, you're not seen as a citizen there. It takes you generations, or your family generations, to be recognized as a quote-unquote real citizen of that country. You don't get that here in America, even if there are some people that would like to see things that way. But how many first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation Americans do you find here? There's a considerable number of those people, and it's part of what makes this country so fascinating. I mean, it would be very, very boring if we were all the same, wouldn't it? I know it can be sometimes, for some people, it's scary, or can be, make somebody anxious to see, like, oh wow, there's, I don't know what these other cultures are like. But when you get to know these people, it is it can be a very eye-opening experience to say, oh wow, these people, there's so much about them that's just like me. Even if they're not Americans, there's still a lot of things that they can respect about America when they encounter us, and we can respect about their cultures when we encounter them. Because anybody has the capacity to become an American. And so that's another important thing to think about, is our relationship with the world. And the World Cup going on right now is a prime example of showing the U.S. at its absolute best, where we're welcoming people, we're celebrating cultures, like how, what was it, Manhattan, Kansas, I think, has taken in Algerian fans, or how you have, I'm trying to think of other specific cities that have had an influx of fans of a particular country coming to see their team, but Japanese people coming to Texas, and just all of these things that people are from other countries are blown away by about America, and not necessarily about American politics, but about American culture in general. I mean, people are smuggling ranch, something that we take for granted, and trying to smuggle it back to their home countries. And so many foreigners are shocked at what America is really like, because so many of them have been told about how rude Americans are and how stuck up and obnoxious we can be. And sure, some of us can be, because every country has those people. But it just goes to show you just how much, hey, when you actually encounter these people, they're human just like us. They have all these other hopes and dreams and likes and dislikes that we have. Even if you put aside the question of what an American is for a second, it's really just a heartwarming thing to see, and it's really showing America at its best. And one of those key ingredients, those key values of being an American, is that respect for cultures coming in to this country, even if they're not actually becoming a part of this country, that they're still visiting. That should be what America is about, or one of the things that America should be about. And it also goes to show you, and this is also something that we need to remember for our own countrymen and women, our own fellow Americans. Citizens are not their government. Even when they vote for these people, they sometimes have just a different conception of what these people are like compared to you. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't be criticized for their choices in voting, but you see, there's this, way too often we treat an entire country as in one homogenous entity, and it's just not like that. Russian people are not the same as the Russian government. Chinese people are not the same as the Chinese government. North Korea's government and people, not the same. Iran's people and government, not the same. Cuba's people and government, not the same. America's people and government, not the same. Every single country, the citizens are not the government, no matter where you go. And sometimes we can treat other people in the world like that, and then we can treat each other like that. When we don't agree with the politics of the current administration in the federal government or in the state government, and we encounter people who did support that ruling government, we start to see them all as the same exact thing, and it's not how we should see things. Yes, there is a very loud, vocal, obnoxious minority that thinks they're way smarter than they actually are, that are very much like the people they put in government. But we should not start treating everybody like that. And that's another important question about what it means to be an American, is our relationship with each other. Because far too often, we are mixing patriotism with partisanship. We're not seeing each other as quote-unquote real Americans. We think the quote-unquote other side is not patriotic, that they are un-American, that they're immoral, that they're out to destroy the country and completely reshape it in their image. Well, funny thing about that is they think the same thing about you, that you're not patriotic, that you're not a real American, that you want to destroy the country, and that you want to impose your views on other people. But being an American means you have to truly respect each other's freedoms of fellow Americans, the differences of opinion. And theoretically, we all support the freedom of speech, but far too often we only support it for people that are like us. Basically joke that I support the freedom of speech unless it's something different than what I think, except for a lot of people, it's not a joke. And so, for some people, it's just a lack of self-awareness. And if they really stopped to think about it, they would realize, oh, wow, you're right. I am doing that. That's not what an American should do. But unfortunately, you have a lot of vocal people that aren't like that. They don't really re-examine themselves. But we have such a melting pot of cultures that you're inevitably going to encounter somebody different than you, even if they are somebody who has some similar viewpoints to you. Not every Republican is going to be the same. Not every Democrat is going to be the same. Not every independent is going to be the same. You have this melting pot of cultures, and they're rooted in origins both inside and outside of America. And you're just going to have this pluralistic culture, which is how it should be. The strength of America is the fact that there are so many different backgrounds of people that can become American, that come to be part of America. Rich, middle class, poor, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, multiracial, male, female, or if you see things as non-binary. Whatever your opinion about gender is, whatever your opinion about sexuality is, all of these people can be American. And far too often we treat these people as less than American, that they're less than human, and that's not how things should be. We have civic responsibilities to each other, and that includes respecting each other's freedoms and ability to express themselves and to be able to voice their own opinions without having to be shouted down or even violently suppressed. That's not how things should be, and we should not be supporting that, because we are all Americans at the end of the day. And I know doesn't mean that everybody in the world is an American, not saying that, but of people who are definitively part of this country, even if you put aside all the politics about immigration for a second, of people who are unequivocally American. This is not how we should be treating each other. And it's not how we should be treating people even if they aren't American either. Even if they are not a citizen of this country, and we agree that they're not citizens of this country, that doesn't mean we should be treating them that way too. Because these are still human beings at the end of the day that we're talking about. You can disagree with things they say and they do and believe, but that does not mean that you get to suppress who they are. You get to suppress what they believe, because that is a very un-American thing to do, even if it does happen a lot of times in this country. When you talk about feelings about America as an American, and I've even said some of my own feelings about that, I think you need to make clear distinctions between patriotism and nationalism and jingoism. Because patriotism is a deep and healthy pride in your country. And really, every country should have pride in not their governments. You should never have pride in your government. Or at least I don't think you should have pride in your government. I don't care what the government is. Maybe your system of government, I have pride in the American system of government, despite its many flaws, because of how it is able to make itself better. And that's what being a patriotic person really is about. You have pride in your country, but you also see how it can be so much better, and you work to improve it. You recognize its flaws, and you can even feel shame about a lot of those flaws. But you also have a strong belief in how that system can be better. That's what patriotism is about. Nationalism takes things a step further, and it starts to be it believes in national superiority and just says, oh, we're superior because we're X country. And it disdains any critiques. You're not allowed to critique the country unless, conveniently, the country's being run by people you don't agree with. But then you get to Jingoism, which is the height of this. It's aggressive, if not outright hostile toward other nations. You can be proud to be an American. You can be proud of what this country is, and you should be, but we'll get to that in a minute. But it doesn't mean you have to trash other countries, especially not allies. It does not mean that you have to put down other people because of their countries. That's not what we should be doing. You can be prideful about your country while still being respectful of other countries. You can be prideful about your country while still wanting to see it get better. Because patriotism, and I'm as reluctant as I am to say what patriotism is, because there's so many people that lecturing others about, being patriotic. But patriotism is not lecturing people about being insufficiently patriotic or deeming only people like you as real Americans. That's not what being patriotic is. Now, you can say that some people that, hey, I think you should have more pride in America because blah, blah, blah. But to just completely trash other people because they have some grievances with America, I don't think that's necessarily the right way to go either. And you're not going to convince other people. But at the same time, being frustrated with America doesn't mean that you should hate this country either. Because if you're going to get mad at a country because of the flaws of its history, well, guess what? You're going to be mad at every single country that has ever existed and that currently exists. Because no country is without blemishes, because they are all comprised of human beings. And no subset of human beings is inherently better than another. Doesn't matter what your religious creed is, your political creed, your race, your gender, your whatever it is. It doesn't matter if you're American or not. we should not be treating any subset of people as inherently superior because they're not. So we should be proud to be an American, but we need to be careful about, we should not be dunking on other people because they're not American. And if people aren't proud of being an American, you need to respect that too. Now, people who aren't proud to be an American should not be excoriating people who are proud to be an American just because they don't agree with them either. Because that's not solving anything either. And that is, ironically, what you're doing is a lot of the things that you complain about America being as well. You can be an American while being prideful of the country. You can be American while being very frustrated with the direction of a country. Especially because you see how in polling about people when they talk about whether they believe the country is heading in the right or wrong direction, a lot of times that's influenced heavily by who's in charge, and Republicans thinking that the country's in the wrong direction because Democrats are in charge, or Democrats thinking the country's in the wrong direction because Republicans are in charge. And pride in a country can dip because of whether or not you support the people in government. And I don't think that that's how it should be either. But at the same time, you should also be able to have a conversation about that. Because holding government accountable for its policies is a completely different thing than just hating America. You should be able to hold America accountable, regardless of who's running it. I don't care if it's a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. It is not above criticism, and we should not be criticizing things purely because they are things that we don't support. Because guess what? Every policy that a government could ever come up with that you have ever thought of, it's going to have a flaw. There are no perfect policies. Does not exist. I hate to break it to you. We should be trying to make all these policies better and be willing to take legitimate constructive criticism. We should also not just be critiquing for the sake of critiquing and just lambasting things just because a lot of people just like to trash everything. But we should be able to have actual conversations about how to improve American politics, because America is and has always been a work in progress, and it's probably always going to be a work in progress because you're never going to have a perfect country. Humanity is never going to be perfect. There's not going to be a subset of humans that ever are perfect. So we need to be careful about this distinction between frustration and despair. And I think that's a line that a lot of people cross. And I'm still reluctant to say we should criticize people who are despairing at America and what they think it's becoming, because I don't think that's necessarily the right course of action too. And you're not going to be bringing people over to your side by doing that. But I think people do also need to be careful about, it's okay to be frustrated with your government, and you should be frustrated with your government to some extent. You should be looking to try to improve things and finding blemishes. It should never get to the point where you hate your country, though. But at the same time, the freedom of speech allows you to do that as well. It allows you to burn an American flag. That's not something I support, but it is part of the freedom of speech. But just because you can do it also doesn't mean you should do it. It's like what Dr. Ian Malcolm said in Jurassic Park. You thought so much about whether you could, you never stopped to think about whether you should. Now, you can still disagree with me about whether you think those kinds of things are, like burning a flag, are appropriate or that they should be done, but that's okay. We should still be able to have a conversation about it. And so, my ultimate take on what being an American means, and I'm not going to say that this is the correct answer, unless it's something that's just so unequivocally objective. I'm very reluctant to say that this is how something is. But here's my attempt at talking about what being an American means, at least to me. It's respect for your fellow country people from all walks of life. And it's respecting their differences, even if you vehemently disagree. Whatever they think about abortion, guns, LGBTQ policies, education, the economy, anything. You should be able to respect those people, even if you can get very frustrated with them. Doesn't mean that you can't be frustrated. Doesn't mean that you can't be angry. But you need to use that frustration and anger in a more constructive way. And you should be able to talk to people that aren't like you. Being an American means you believe in the basic promise of the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was a very flawed document because when Thomas Jefferson wrote it, he was thinking of white men and perhaps only white men that had property. But with the way it's written and the way that America has gone and how the U.S. Constitution was created and how the framers of the Constitution and the founding fathers created this country and founded it, they found it in a way where it had a certain basis that was American, but what America means and what it includes could be expanded over time. It could go along with the times to some extent, so that core part of what being an American is and what an American system of government is was the same, but it could still be vastly improved over time. And that has vastly improved over time. We've expanded voting rights to other races, or besides just white people, to people that don't have land, to 18-year-olds, to women. It should have been like that at the beginning, but at least it eventually did become that way. And even though we don't always emulate those ultimate core values like we should, the fact that we can still talk about those things and make things better and work towards fully realizing those ideals, that is what being an American is. It's that belief in the freedom of expression, especially those that are shown in the First Amendment of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. Did I miss one? Speech, assembly, petition, redress grievances, religion. Yes. So those First Amendment beliefs and all the beliefs or the other Bill of Rights of the Ninth Amendment of any rights not expressly stated in the Constitution belong to the people. You look at the preamble of the Constitution. We the people in order to form a more perfect union. It's the belief in the ability to critique our government without reprisal. It's the belief in the ability to expand on the basic promise of the Declaration of Independence so that it can apply to all people, regardless of race, religious creed, political creed, gender. It's a belief in that marketplace of ideas so that we can continue to improve as Americans, because you don't improve when you shut out other ideas, because you're never going to reach perfection. So you have to hear other opinions about how to make this nation better, especially with how many different cultures are living side by side. Because America is not about a political or religious belief. It's a spirit. And you see it in the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, in countless writings since then, and all these different concepts of how to make America better, but still that ultimate belief in America and what it can be. And so, if you have your own take on what being an American is, I'd love to hear those ideas too, because this is not something that should just be a one-off in a podcast. It should be something that we constantly think about, because it's just too important of a question to consider that it's been fully answered, because it might not ever be fully answered, but it's something that we should still consider. And in fact, some ideas or some concepts of what being an American is, and I'll just read some of them from what I've found on the internet. And I'll actually have a link to a couple of these as well so you can see the full answers. But one idea was that Americans often have the privilege of being a part of many communities that help define themselves as complex, unique individuals. And the past few years have demonstrated that our communities define America, a prospect that could be concerning and hopeful. And many other groups, both intersecting and not, also came to sit in solidarity, reminding me that American values are rooted in communities that uphold understanding, inclusivity, and respect. And to me, being an American means being free. I am free to embrace my Japanese and Filipino heritage. I am free to learn and celebrate other cultures. I am free to express myself through my physical experience or appearance and my words. I am free to speak another language and learn many more. I am free to take advantage of the opportunities in America. But those are just a couple of the other answers that people have. And so in these questions, even though a lot of them can be different, you still see a similar through line through all of those. And ultimately, I hope that this 250th anniversary of American independence leads to this to a civic renewal, to this ability to be able to earnestly reappraise this question of what it means to be an American, and for us to be a lot more respectful of each other and each other's opinions and cultures, because that's what being an American really is about. So we'll end things here for this episode of the podcast. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. And it's amazing to think that 100 episodes of this podcast have already come out. But I just want to take the time to thank all of you. And in fact, I want to go ahead and also thank all of the people that I have had on this podcast. And of course, plan to have many more guests as well, and about all sorts of different things. So we'll talk about or list them right here. So, and you, of course, you can look back on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts to look at all of these episodes. But we have episode 9, American Schism, which was Seth David Radwell. Mary Noon, episode 29 on gerrymandering. Laura Forkham, episode 33 about the psychology of independence. Jack Moore, episode 35 about the JFK files. Scylla Avgil, episode 39 about open primaries. Graham Bernstein and Jacob Kaplan, episode 49 about bipartisan legislative advocacy. Guy Burgess and Heidi Burgess about episode 51 with constructive political discussions. Alex Vassar, episode 52, preserving political history. Shaka Mitchell, episode 53, education and civic engagement. Luis Enrique Marquez, episode 55 about protesting. Lauren Hall, episode 56, radical moderation. Nathan C. Smolensky, episode 61, finding common ground. Lisa Ekman, episode 62, reevaluating our own beliefs. Shannon Watson, episode 63, Americans in the Middle. Ronika Matheny, episode 64, accessibility of civics. Crom Carmichael, episode 65, historical thinkers and the present. Doug Kaplan, episode 66, polling informing conversations. Travis Miserel, episode 67, empowering citizens. Peter Cohen, episode 68, Supreme Court of the United States and presidential power. Liz Vogel, episode 70, about pluralism. Dan McMillan, episode 71, about campaign finance reform. Alex Patton, episode 74, misunderstandings about campaigns. Claire Sherrill, episode 76, about an app about revolutionizing civic engagement. Felicia Caleros, episode 77, about encouraging and incentivizing depolarization. Stephanie Houghton, episode 78, improving youth voter turnout. Daniel Yudkin, episode 79, about civic renewal. Episode 80 was Burt Ralston, mobilizing political supporters. Ramon Perez, episode 83, about an app to revolutionize government accountability. Michael Lee, episode 86, about what political civility really is, or in fact, civility in general. Metin Pekin, episode 88, the potential of a partyless future. And Tom Joseph, episode 89, about a new way to nominate candidates. And that includes Democrats, Republicans, and independents, because this episode is not, or this podcast is not about favoring any one particular group. I want a whole array of opinions on a whole array of different topics. Because A, I find it interesting to hear other opinions. B, I want to learn more about all these other topics that I may have some knowledge of, but there may be other things I haven't considered. But also, again, that's what America is about, this marketplace of ideas to be able to express ourselves. It should not be about siloing ourselves and not hearing other people's opinions. If we really respect the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression, we should be trying to hear people out more. And so that's what I'll leave you with. So links in the show notes, my other works, which include my book on political independence, which you can buy on Amazon and several other retailers, my 5-day educational email course about how we can all more effectively mitigate toxicity and polarization in politics, my medium.com profile, which I write on from time to time, and then my other links, my Facebook, LinkedIn, website, and email. So once again, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all for making 100 episodes of this podcast possible and for making future episodes of this podcast possible. So, we'll see you next time.